right, everyone. Shall we get going? Good afternoon and welcome to Matrix and to our lunchtime lecture series we have here. Some of you may have been, when you haven't been following the coronavirus or the primaries over the last few weeks, may have stumbled across a story that operated under the tagline of Luanda leaks. And this was a story that pertained to Angola and to the daughter of the former president, and a series of leaks, hacks that partly the product of some investigative journalists documenting the staggering corruption in and around the Dos Santos family and the national oil company in Angola. And of course, that's not a big surprise to anyone who studies the industry. The current political crisis in Brazil was, of course, triggered in part by the famous car wash corruption case. Also involved Petrobras, the national oil company. Halliburton found guilty, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, of paying off lots of people with lots of money in Nigeria. The Biam Malaki case, corruption involving Central African leaders found guilty in the French legal court system, etc. All of this is, quite commonplace in the industry, and this is what, in fact, Alex Gillies has spent the last 10 years of her life delving into in various sorts of ways, and has brought together, really, the last 10 years of her work with her new book, which I'm going to wave around here and say that I'm going to be incidentally handing out some flyers here for the book, and if you're interested in buying one, you can get a discount, Alex. Is that correct? There's a discount code there. Alex was trained in international relations at Cambridge University, where in more than 10 years ago, she wrote about the Nigerian oil and gas sector, and focusing especially on the national oil company. She was attached to Northwestern University for a while, but more recently she served as an advisor to NRGI, the Natural Resources Governance Institute in New York. And for those of you who don't know it, it's arguably one of the most important, if not the most important, advocacy groups advocating around the politics of the extractive industries more generally. And she's produced, along with her fellow workers there, some of the most important work exposing some of the corrupt practices within the industry as a whole. Not exclusively in Africa, but Africa has been a center of her concerns, but the material that she covers in this book extends way beyond the African continent and involves actors in it more than the national oil companies and the IOCs, but the trading houses, the brokers, the intermediaries, the politicians, and so on, that are part of what we might call the oil complex, if you like. And that's really the heart of what Alex is going to be talking about today. The title of the book is Crude Intentions, How Oil Corruption Contaminates the World. And we're delighted to be able to have her here today to expose to us those workings of the oil and gas industry. Alex, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here, and thanks all for joining. And it's a real honor to be here with Michael, as someone, as he mentioned, who studied Nigeria as a graduate student. His work is path-breaking and was a real inspiration to me as I was trying to learn about that fascinating, complex country. I've been working on this book for a number of years, longer than it should have taken. And over the course of the project, I got kind of the same questions from people over and over again. So I'll try to preemptively answer a few of those questions and then look forward to a discussion after I've gone over a little bit of the content. The first question is, why would you write a book about that? And really starts that, back in 2001, oil cost $18 a barrel. By 2008, it cost $140 a barrel. And from 2008 to 2014, oil prices were historically high. And it sent about $9 trillion of new money into oil-rich countries and into the oil industry. When this oil boom really got going in 2008, I was spending a lot of time in Nigeria, living there for a stretch and then visiting frequently. And two things became very clear. One was there was just huge amounts of money sloshing around. And second was, sorry, is this, I think the copies, the one with my little marks. Yes. These little tags are very important. So it was clear that there was so much money sloshing around and that corruption was increasing. So let me just read a couple paragraphs that describes this scene. In 2012, a scandal broke and revealed that the government had paid fuel importers for billions of dollars worth of gasoline and diesel that had never actually entered the country. But then no senior officials lost their jobs. No one was convicted of wrongdoing in court, and many of the alleged culprits kept doing business with the government. Around the same time, the government began awarding huge and oddly structured contracts to secretive local companies with hardly any oil industry experience. Stories of backroom payoffs, stolen cargo loads of oil, and other crimes grew more frequent and more convincing. The mythology surrounding the oil minister grew too. Friends and acquaintances traded stories about her apparent neglect of important industry functions, the crew of loyal henchmen who gathered in her house at night, and her plans for using the booming oil sector to benefit herself and the president. During this time, you'd walk into Abuja's Hilton Hotel, the country's unofficial deal-making headquarters, which would be familiar to any of you who've done work in Abuja, and it was just throbbing. Power players and their retinues clustered around the elevators, heading upstairs to the private suites where various bigwigs held court. Businessmen and women from around the world staked out corners of the lobby's piano bar to strike deals. Large paintings of the petroleum minister could be purchased at the hotel's tourist shop alongside overpriced traditional cloths and jewelry. Five-figure watches and designer bags became standard attire for the drivers, security guards, and mistresses who crowded the hallways. You could smell the money in the air. And so despite that kind of environment, at the time, even though I was in the middle of it, literally researching oil industry issues, it was very difficult to understand exactly what was going wrong. It was a lot of rumors and accusations and different numbers flying around. But then over the course of the next few years, the explanations did start to come out. A senior government official from Nigeria blew the whistle and publicly accused the national oil company of mismanaging its funds. A couple years later, Italian prosecutors charged a few oil companies for their involvement in a corruption scheme that saw $1 billion escape from public funds, from public accounts. US court cases shed further light on different schemes, as did Swiss court cases, and all this information started coming, painting a picture of what the corruption had looked like during the oil boom. And this information wasn't just coming from Nigeria. In 2015, the car wash scandal broke open that Michael mentioned. And this is a corruption scandal that started in the Brazilian oil industry, but has since spread across Latin America. In 2016, the Panama Papers came out and shed light on a number of oil industry deals, and a few other leaks and court cases came along. The same year, the world started to learn about this 1MDB corruption case from Malaysia that involved a Saudi oil company and the oil savings fund from Abu Dhabi. In 2017, there was a slew of NGO investigations from Congo-Brazzaville, Azerbaijan, and elsewhere, and this kind of information from court cases, leaks, NGO investigations kept coming and coming. And so I set out to try to look across these cases and figure out, what we could learn from them, looking in particular at this period of the oil boom. Another question I've gotten is well, obviously the oil industry is corrupt. We all kind of assumed that. Why should we care? And first off, I would say that, corruption is not something that happens in some faraway place in Nigeria or Malaysia or whatever. These schemes are global enterprises, and their tentacles reach around the world and cause destabilizing effects, including here at home. US accounting firms, law firms, and other professionals help structure the corruption schemes. The stolen money ends up here too. In a number of the cases I looked at, illicit funds bought real estate and invested in companies here in California. But that's just the beginning of why it should matter to us. Nearly half of the world's people who live in extreme poverty do so in oil-rich countries. And in a number of those oil-rich countries, poverty numbers are increasing rather than going down, such as in Nigeria, Angola, or Venezuela. In Brazil, the price overruns on one corrupt refinery project topped $14 billion, which is enough to educate 4 million Brazilian school children for a year. And so oil corruption worsens wealth inequality problems and stands in the way of the world meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. Corruption has wreaked havoc on the politics of many oil-rich countries. The oil industry helps prop up some of the world's most repressive dictators. In some cases, citizens have risen up, but if corruption has hollowed out the state, like we saw in Libya, power vacuums and instability follow. In other countries, such as in Iraq, frustration can lead to extremism or violence. In democracies, corruption can lead citizens to lose faith in their governments. Betrayed by the dirty deeds of the incumbent political class, they may either disengage from the democratic process or embrace more extremist groups or candidates. And to meet climate change targets, the fossil fuel industry must decline. But the industry is full of companies who regularly have chosen profits over responsible behavior. And it's full of undemocratic regimes that depend on oil money for their personal fortunes, but also their political survival. Just some ideas on kind of what's at stake. The other question I got a lot is, isn't that really depressing? And it actually, the project turned out to be far less depressing than I maybe thought it would be. Executives and politicians, wheeler dealers of various sorts absolutely captured more than their fair share of the oil boom, and they continue to do so. But they're not untouchable. What looking across all these cases revealed is that there are a lot of common tactics and trends, and that those can be the building blocks for building smarter anti-corruption responses. So I want to just offer a few of the kind of trends that I was able to observe that I think shed light on how we could do anti-corruption work a bit better. Some of the book talks about the strategies that oil companies use to tilt the playing field in their favor. Bribery is obviously a big one. And what looking at those cases revealed, one interesting thing is that there's a lot of confusion and complexity in defining corruption and defining who's to blame. So one of the cases I talk about a lot involves this outfit called Unioil, which was based in Monaco. And if you were an oil engineering company or an oil construction company and wanted to win contracts in a tricky place like Iraq or Syria or Algeria, you might hire Unioil to be your agent, to go represent you in that country, to provide information about how the tender was going to work, what kind of information you had to provide, etc. But it turns out that in at least 8 countries, Unioil was bribing public officials on behalf of its clients so that its clients gained an advantage in competing for these contracts. And a bunch of leaked emails came out. So Unioil personnel talking to each other about, one of them was describing, okay, we have to bribe this official in Iraq because he is going to provide us with insider information about a tender. He's going to overlook some quality control issues. And the email said he's going to generally be a friend in a nest of vipers. And so this case is one of the clear-cut ones. Unioil paid bribes, and in return, they received very specific advantages. And so what you have there is a quid pro quo, this term that we heard more than we wanted to in the recent impeachment proceedings. It's a bit rare in terms of the major scandals for it to be that clear. And I want to just mention a couple other cases to demonstrate the real gray area that defines most of the corruption cases. Early in the oil boom, the Gaddafi regime was still in power in Libya, and they set up a sovereign wealth fund to save all this extra oil money and put about $40 billion into it. As a result, investment banks from across the US and Europe rushed to Tripoli and tried to win business investing that money. The representatives from Goldman Sachs took the sovereign wealth fund officials on fancy vacations, 5-star hotels all over the world, sporting events, West End musicals, sushi dinners, even a couple prostitutes. They provided financial markets training for the low-level personnel at the sovereign wealth fund. And it worked. The sovereign wealth fund invested $1.2 billion in some very risky derivative trades that Goldman was making, and they lost it all, because it happened to be right when the financial crisis took hold. Every cent of their $1.2 billion. And so they sued Goldman. And a UK civil court reviewed all of this whining and dining and was like, no, that was fine. That's normal business as usual. It did not cause the sovereign wealth fund to make these investments. Do I think it's problematic? Yeah, probably, but they did not. So it's this gray area. Another case here in the US, which is in the situation I'll describe is indicative of much wider trends that you would be familiar with. A Texas state representative named Drew Darby sits on the Department of Interior's committee that decides how much oil companies should pay in royalties when they're producing oil on federal land, so in the Gulf of Mexico, for instance. Those same companies, so he's sitting on the committee deciding how much companies should pay in royalties. Some of those companies, the American ones in particular, were his largest campaign donors. And in the US system, none of that is illegal, and none of that is kept particularly secret. And in fact, this kind of relationship is celebrated. This guy, Drew Darby, was named in 2013 by the Texas Oil and Gas Association as he received their Legislative Champion Award. So is that a quid pro quo or not? The kind of extensive campaign donations followed with a very pro-industry stance in his representative role. A third case that I think demonstrates the further complexity comes from Nigeria. In 2011, Shell and Eni, two of the world's largest oil companies, wanted this very promising oil block in Nigeria. And so they negotiated with the Nigerian government, and they made a payment of $1.3 billion, and in exchange, they received the rights to the oil block. Almost immediately, $1 billion of that money left the government accounts. And some of it went to pay off former and at the time current senior government officials, including the president and the oil minister, according to some allegations. And so Shell and Eni, when this scandal broke open, they were like, it's not our fault. We didn't pay off the president. We didn't pay off the oil minister or these other political elites. We paid the government. And then the money went missing. That's not our fault. We can't control what the government does with their money. Is that a bribe? Is it not? But this is where I think there is some promising news, is that Shell and Eni are on trial in Italy right now for their bribery. And at least some Italian prosecutors who are bringing the case say, yeah, you are responsible. That even though the money went into government accounts first, you knew that it was going to end up in the pockets of government officials, and you didn't prevent it from happening. The jury the verdict in the court, in this court case, is expected in the next month or two, so we'll see what they say. But at a minimum, they've had to appear in court, both the companies and some senior level executives. So I think what that shows is that even though some of these corruption cases are very complicated, the responses can evolve as well. So in addition to looking at what companies got up to, a lot of the book looks at how political elites managed to get their hands on a share of the oil boom, the oil wealth. And I contrast what that looks like in countries with more competitive political systems like Nigeria, Brazil, the US, with what it looks like in more authoritarian or kleptocratic contexts where I look at Russia, Azerbaijan, and Angola. And I want to just read a really quick example from, pretty kind of straightforward example from Russia, which I think helps kind of illustrate a few other trends that were observed not only in Russia, but really widely across the board. Let me just get to the right place. Russia's national oil companies also spent handsomely on various goods and services during the oil boom. As Putin consolidated his control over Rosneft and Gazprom, the two state-owned giants of the oil and gas sector, he could more easily control which oligarch received lucrative subcontracting opportunities. In doing so, Putin decided who gets to get rich, one of the great political tools available to kleptocrats. Gazprom spent billions of dollars on pipeline construction during the oil boom. Some observers conclude that the company built way more pipelines than it needed, forgoing shorter and easier options in favor of longer and more complicated ones. They also paid well above market price, with one 1,500-mile pipeline costing $44 billion, or 3 times more the industry standard costs. The brothers Arkady and Boris Rottenberg handled a chunk of this pipeline business. Old friends of Putin from their days sparring at a St. Petersburg judo club, the Rottenbergs sit atop a new class of oligarchs who rose under Putin's rule. Mammoth deals with Gazprom fueled their ascendance and their unshakable loyalty to Putin. Much of the business they received involved purchasing gas pipes from one company and then selling them to Gazprom, a middleman function that was not strictly necessary. Experts estimate that corruption and inefficiency, including inflated contracts, cost Gazprom $40 billion a year during the oil boom. But for Putin, these were not losses at all. The spending created loyal billionaires dedicated to strengthening his rule. So this, that simple case of the Rottenbergs getting these inflated pipeline construction contracts from Gazprom speaks to kind of 3 trends that were very common across the cases I looked at. One is national oil companies are very prone to corruption and very prone to manipulation by political elites. There's a couple of reasons why. First is they have huge amounts of money flowing through their accounts. And the second is that they sit kind of outside of the standard government institutions. And therefore, like the head of the national oil company often is appointed by the president, reports directly to the president, and is easy for political elites to manipulate its functions. Another trend is that certain parts of the oil industry appear more susceptible to corruption than others. Often if you read the news about the oil industry, most of the attention is about the exploration and production deals. So which companies win the rights to actually produce the oil? So these are the kinds of deals that a company like Chevron or Exxon or Shell would win. And they are the biggest prizes, the biggest dollar deals in the oil industry. But for a smart government, and especially for one that has longer time horizons, you don't mess with those deals. That's not where you put your corruption, because you need those companies to feel very comfortable so that they come in with tens of billions of dollars and invest it in your country and do so over decades. And so what you see, especially in places like Russia or Angola or Azerbaijan, is that some of these upstream functions, the exploration and production functions, ran well. And instead, the corruption was pushed to other parts of the oil industry. 2 in particular. One is what's called in industry like oil field services. So these are those kind of subcontracts that Gazprom, exactly like I was reading about, or Exxon or Shell, they don't do a lot of the work themselves. They contract it out. And these contracts run the gamut. They can be for, huge construction contracts to build an oil rig, or contracts to a small local company to provide catering services. Across the board, lots of corruption risks, and these service contracts appear in the corruption cases I looked at over and over and over again across dozens of countries. The car wash scandal in Brazil was about these contracts, for example. The other area, and one that Michael and I are working on together a little bit, is in oil trading. And we can, if anyone's interested, we can get into the details of this in the Q&A, but basically, oil-rich governments end up with a share of their oil production, and then they have to sell it, either to, refineries or to oil traders. Those sale transactions, especially when prices are high, are very easy locations for rent seeking to crop up. And so these oil field services, subcontracting transactions, and the oil trading transactions appear to be very at risk for corruption across a really diverse range of countries. The third trend that the Rottenberg scenario illustrates is really the most prevalent and kind of systematic type of corruption that I observed, especially in kleptocratic regimes, but elsewhere too. And this is political elites awarding lucrative and often overly lucrative business opportunities to family members, to their favorite oligarchs, or to other political insiders. There's 3 reasons why that form of corruption is particularly difficult to combat. The first is that it's often legal. So the political leaders who are orchestrating these awards are the same ones who are writing the rules of the game. Like Gazprom doesn't need to break the law in order to award an inflated pipeline construction contract. It can do so legally. The second challenge is that the political leaders, like Putin, may never actually see any money out of this. A lot of journalists and others have tried to trace the money from oligarchs like Rottenberg into Putin's accounts. Like, how did he himself actually profit off of this? Again, what's the quid pro quo? Like, the businesses, the oligarchs got these juicy contracts. How much did Putin get? But in reality, he may have gotten nothing. Instead, by making them rich, Putin deepened his control over the country's wealth and created some very wealthy allies who, if needed, would probably do him some favors. And so that makes it more difficult to kind of pin down, or for law enforcement to kind of go after this kind of corruption. The third challenge is that, so the regime helps these oligarchs or these insiders to get rich. The smart ones then turn those opportunities into global business empires. And those business activities give them a kind of legitimacy. It kind of integrates them into the global economy. Azerbaijan's former transportation minister and his son both became billionaires during the oil boom, in large part from business in the transportation sector. A spokesperson from the transport ministry was asked about the kinds of conflicts of interest that this can create. And she said, "Only the interests of Azerbaijan matter to the minister. Maybe these businesses do belong to someone close to the minister. But if these people propose efficient and strong projects, why shouldn't they be preferred?" And indeed, in Azerbaijan, it's very difficult to do any kind of business without working with a politically connected oligarch, because they've taken their initial advantages they got from their political connections and turned them into business empires that dominate the entire country's economy. So these trends are daunting, but they do have some implications for what smarter anti-corruption strategies would look like. First is that we need better oversight and more scrutiny over the really obvious problem areas. So national oil companies, oil trading, oil service contracts. You focus where the obvious problems are. Another implication is that we need new understandings of how foreign companies are enabling these kinds of politically connected business empires to grow. Michael mentioned the Luanda leaks, which was all about the business affairs of Isabel dos Santos, who is the daughter of Angola's former dictator. Companies from around the world partnered with dos Santos and her business empire. Like, she was a billionaire and invested in all kinds of industries. PwC, KPMG, et cetera, like everyone worked with her. They knew she was the dictator's daughter. But until the Luanda leaks shone a big spotlight on this, they were okay with that. And now all of a sudden, because there's a scandal, they're all cutting ties and running for the door. But we need to update our understanding of who is acceptable to do business with and who is not. And I think the Luanda leaks hopefully is prompting some of these international companies to look at their client list and say, maybe we should consider getting rid of a few other of these family members or close associates of other dictators around the world. So this all still sounds really depressing. So but the real kind of silver lining that I see is that all of the cases I describe are success stories. Like, they didn't get away with it. We know what happened. And so the parties involved are at least facing some kind of reputational costs, if not also legal and financial consequences. And the success of anti-corruption actors, I feel like too often gets overshadowed by the crimes that they expose and how bad those are, and don't get the attention that they deserve. In some more democratic countries, it's domestic oversight institutions that are scoring big wins. I mean, the car wash scandal was exposed by Brazilian police, even though it involved some of the most powerful individuals in that country. In Nigeria and in Malaysia, the elections worked, and citizens were able to vote out very corrupt incumbents, even though those incumbents had a lot of money and had a lot of influence. The elections worked well enough that they were shown the door. In kleptocracies, it's more difficult because the political leaders tend to control the elections. They tend to control the police. Their capture of the state is more complete. But luckily, it's not just domestic actors that are fighting corruption. Some of the international, like in some of the cases, the international array of anti-corruption actors is as international as the corruption scheme itself. With the Luanda leaks, with Panama Papers and others, you had hundreds of journalists in dozens of countries collaborating, joining forces, orchestrating the release so that all their stories came out on the same day. Like, it's incredible, these unprecedented forms of cross-border collaboration among investigative journalists. You've got, watchdog groups, like small NGOs with relatively shoestring budgets, releasing exposés of dictators, companies that end up, having real consequences. And those groups are, punching way above their weight, I think, in terms of fighting corruption. Also promising is that prosecutors are going after companies and other actors for behavior that literally 10 years ago would have been dismissed as business as usual. I mentioned the case that the Italians have brought against Shell and Eni, and frankly, I've talked to executives from those companies, and they're aghast that they're being held to account in this way. So there's evolutions there. And law enforcement in a number of countries is also finding creative and effective ways of going after offshore flows of illicit funds. The US government, in a couple Nigeria cases, so there's a case in one case from Nigeria, the US didn't have the jurisdiction to go after the crime itself, right? They suspected that some bribery had happened in Nigeria. But as soon as some of the funds that came from that deal entered the US or entered US bank accounts, in this case, they bought some property in California, they bought a $50 million yacht that Jay-Z and Beyonce once rented out for a couple of weeks. You know, as soon as those assets entered the US, they were able to seize them. And in doing so, they also publicized their account of the wrongdoing. So when they seized the assets, this 150-page account of the corruption went up on the DOJ website. And you see similar actions, Michael mentioned the Bien Malaki case in France, where the French government, again, in something that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago, is going after some of the money that Central African dictators are spending on insane collections of sport cars and mansions, et cetera, in Paris and elsewhere. The UK passed something called the Unexplained Wealth Orders, which is a very innovative new tool. And basically, if you're a foreign official and you go to London and you buy a $30 million house and your official salary is $30,000 a year, the UK government can issue you an unexplained wealth order, and you have to explain where that money came from. They don't have to prove any corruption happened. They don't have to, they're not bringing criminal charges. You just have to explain where that money came from. And so these kind of innovative tools show that anti-corruption strategies can adapt to match the way that corruption works in today's globalized world. And so rather than just kind of wringing our hands about how bad it is, we need to kind of look at what these successful strategies are and treat them with the kind of urgency that the challenge demands. So let me stop there, and I would love to hear, do you want me to just do the Q&As, or how do you want to? Yeah, okay. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead. I mean, my sense, without having good data on that, is that it's nowhere near as difficult a weaning process as it is from the fossil fuel industry. Like the importance of facilitating potentially corrupt deals economically is not, of any kind of existential value to banks, like even ones like Deutsche Bank, which have been involved in like 10 different money laundering scandals, or Goldman Sachs or other like large players. I do think there are much smaller kind of boutique outfits. And I mean, I know from working in Nigeria, you would see consultants or agents, people kicking around who specialized in packaging these kinds of deals. But those are much smaller outfits who have found a real niche in doing that. I think, again, another exception might be some of the industry that exists around setting up shell companies in secrecy jurisdictions. So there are companies all around the world who specialize in, they will run thousands of companies that are all just shell companies, and they can be in the UK, but also in places like the Cayman Islands or the British Virgin Islands and elsewhere. So there is kind of an industry there that serves a lot of tax avoidance purposes, but also has been used extensively in these kinds of corruption schemes. And I hope that its days are numbered, that over time that kind of function within the global economy will start to narrow so much that it doesn't make good business sense, but it's still happening quite a bit.
Hi, thanks for the great presentation and for the fascinating book. I had a question about the title. So I don't know if the title was like a deliberate emphasis on the intentions part, or if that was something that's negotiated with the publisher. But I'm wondering if you could kind of situate the title in relation to
Right. You already have read more into the title than I intended to be. My sister-in-law came up with it, literally at her kitchen table. But I think in your question is embedded something that, I often get questions about, isn't just this the way some places function? And that trying to bring some kind of normative assumptions to it about it being wrong or crude or whatever is inappropriate, or it doesn't account for kind of the different relative ways that different economies function. And frankly, at least with the kinds of corruption that I work on, which tends to be very high level, not the day-to-day type stuff, I personally don't buy into any of that. I think that there's nothing about Nigeria that makes it any more okay what those government officials did to manipulate their positions of power for the benefit of themselves and those close to them. So if the title captures some of that, then good. On the development banks, I mean, one way it comes up is in the introduction, and I kind of talked about it at the beginning, I talk about what it was like to be living in Nigeria when all of this corruption was escalating, and yet no one seemed to be doing anything. And the international community, including the World Bank and the IMF, were chief among those who seemed to just be like, la 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 la, this isn't happening. And then as soon as the new government came in and the government that had presided over that corruption left, they were like, oh, let us help you with all of your anti-corruption efforts. But they had been there when all the money was being stolen and hadn't done anything. And I think there was a tendency towards politeness, especially on like the US embassies, didn't want to ruffle any feathers. I think there's often institutional incentives that lead the IFIs and other development banks and others to want to lend money and want to keep their programs running, and not to kind of throw a wrench in the works by being like, oh, our partners may not be trustworthy. And there's certainly other examples of, the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development giving huge amounts of money to build gas pipelines in Azerbaijan, again, kind of willfully ignoring the corruption issues for energy security reasons. There might be different motives at play, but I do think that there are a disturbing number of instances you could point to where the institutions have incentives to kind of look the other way. There is some pulling back from financing fossil fuel projects directly, which it seems appropriate. But there's also a lot of cases recently where the IMF has just recently negotiated loan agreements with a few resource-rich countries in Central Africa, including Equatorial Guinea and Angola and Chad, where at least for Chad and Equatorial Guinea, you have oil-rich governments, and Congo-Brazzaville as well, where the dictators have been in power for decades. They squandered the oil boom, ended up in severe debt situations, and now the IMF is coming to bail them out. And yes, there's conditionality and stuff in those agreements, but is it enough? And I think those are really important. The funding is for general, to bolster the country's general finances, not for the oil-specific stuff. But I think some of those questions are really important. On the new producers, my colleague is here, Patrick Heller. He just got back from Uganda and was having meetings with Ugandan officials who are, to varying degrees, trying to figure out how they can avoid the pitfalls. Just not having decades of dysfunction is a huge advantage in and of itself. I think working in Nigeria, but also places like Iraq and Venezuela and elsewhere, once the rent-seeking and the vested interests are embedded, getting rid of them is so hard. And so just starting from a clean slate, as Ghana and other countries did, is enormously helpful. I also think that the expectations have changed around transparency and oversight a lot, that in a country like Ghana that is relatively democratic and relatively open, the oil sector was run in a way that was much more transparent from the start than what you would have seen in the 70s or 80s, that kind of thing. But that's not to say, the one that everyone's talking about right now is Guyana, which has huge, huge amounts of oil, tiny country, and they're just gonna have, you know, potentially hundreds of billions of dollars in oil money coming their way. And will they fall victim to the resource curse? It's not necessarily true, but the risks are still so high, even though I think we have learned a lot about what kinds of institutional arrangements and others might be helpful in mitigating some of the risks. There's still just so much money flowing in that the potential for it to go wrong is there. So, yeah, hi. Yeah, I think it's a really important contribution. The most glaring one that comes to my mind is when the Crown Prince, MBS, rounded up a few hundred top Saudi businessmen and locked them up in the Ritz on corruption charges, which was basically a shakedown and a power move to kind of consolidate his own position atop the royal family. But it was all done in the name of fighting corruption, and there was corruption. Like, it would also addressed a real problem, you know, and like Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela dismissed almost all the senior staff at the National Oil Company on corruption charges, and put in people who are highly unqualified to play their roles. But was there corruption going on? Yes, and so same thing in China with so especially kind of for, well, maybe not especially, but with these domestic anti-corruption campaigns, they frequently make progress when they align with political objectives, and then it just depends on the strength of the institutions whether that alignment leads to kind of credible progress as well. I think, I mean, I'm not a Brazil expert, I wouldn't say, but I still find very impressive the independent work that the police and aspects of the judiciary did in the early stages of the car wash investigation to expose what had happened and start bringing bringing powerful people to justice. I think once it got going, various political elites saw what was happening and started using it for their own advantage. But that doesn't mean that nothing good happened there. And so I acknowledge the slipperiness and the complexity of it, but there's some voices in the field who are saying, like, oh, you know, we shouldn't support or push for more prosecutions of this kind or more exposés, because all it does is, you know, people lose hope in their institutions. They just think more negatively. And that doesn't resonate kind of with my understanding of how progress is being made, because you know, even in the Nigerian context where like power alternates quite frequently, and if you know that in a couple years another group is going to be in power and might look to come at you with anti-corruption charges, that might lead you to be more careful in the way you're going about your business. It's all hypothetical, and trying to kind of come up with neat ways to measure this is, I think, very challenging. But I think what you raised is super interesting and important. My organization does a lot of transparency promotion, trying to get governments and companies to publish more data about their oil and mining sector affairs. And it's come under some criticism because we've made some gains. There is more information getting out there, including through the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which is this reporting system that 50 countries have signed up to, and they disclose more information about their sector. And the criticism says, well, all the information's here, why is there still corruption? Or why is there still governance problems? And to me, that, you know, whoever thought transparency was going to fix corruption, that in order to get at a problem that's as multifaceted and intertwined with power as corruption is, we need multiple tools. Transparency is one of them. And I think what's good about it is that it's tangible, it's measurable. You know, for a while, the UN and other bodies were pushing countries to sign anti-corruption laws or set up anti-corruption commissions. And those are the kind of measures that you can do it, and they may never, you know, it could be real just window dressing. Whereas with transparency, like, the information's out there. Like, there is some, when disclosure happens, even if it's not immediately used, I think the act of disclosure has a normative change on the conception of whose resources they are. That like, because these are public resources, we have to disclose information about how they're being managed. And that normative shift is important even if the information isn't being, even if like local communities aren't taking incredibly complicated tax data and using it every day to hold companies to account. But I think the most important message is that it's one of many strategies, and that it has to be the transparency plus the law enforcement plus the investigative, the leaks and the investigative journalism work, and also making the global financial system less amenable to running these kinds of schemes, getting rid of anonymous shell companies, making it so that you can't buy property down the road in huge all-cash sales through some anonymous LLC that no one asks any questions about. Some of those policy reforms, I think, are another key ingredient. So I'm, like, even though the results have not necessarily been transformative of the EITI and other initiatives, I never expected them to be, and am still a strong ally along with other stuff. One conclusion that I talk about a lot in the book is how the globalization of the corruption schemes and their cross-border nature and the involvement of actors from US and Europe, etc., helps the schemes to grow and to succeed and enrich their participants, and it creates lots of vulnerabilities. And a lot of these schemes were broken open because of their cross-border elements, because the money entered the US, or because some, Swiss company was involved and there's some Swiss NGOs that were digging into their affairs. They found out what had happened in Congo-Brazzaville, or, So I think it's a two-sided coin, that cryptocurrency or leaks or, the shell companies and the mobility of capital, et cetera, can cut both ways. That was, I think, one of the kind of silver lining takeaways that I really had is that the cross-border nature of corruption is a positive as well as a problem. On your much bigger question, I think, about kind of energy transition issues, there's a few different elements to it. There are minerals for which demand is going to increase over the coming years that are needed for batteries, et cetera. A lot of the world's coltan, for example, comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has struggled for decades with not oil sector corruption, but mining sector corruption. And so you could absolutely see these same kinds of problems and dynamics accelerating in those markets where demand for those strategic minerals is increasing already and will continue to increase. There's some interesting efforts to try to engage with technology companies that are the end users of those minerals and try to make them responsible for the supply chains and to care about where those minerals are coming from, but it's also easier said than done. Yes, including here. Yes. For the oil producers, there is a risk of a kind of race to the bottom, where, especially for countries where their oil is more expensive, and if global demand for fossil fuels hopefully starts to decline, those countries will be left trying to court investors. Please come get our oil and take it out of the ground and give us some money for it. So there could be this race to the bottom in terms of tax levels, regulatory standards, as those countries try to monetize their fossil fuel resources. It's too early to see that. I think it's too early to see that playing out yet, but it makes sense that that risk scenario could unfold as the energy transition kind of takes hold. The other thing I think about a lot is, like, what does it mean politically for oil-dependent countries like Saudi Arabia for the industry to decline significantly? Like, it could be a source of political instability. They use oil money to run their country and to keep their citizens on board. And if that money started to dry up and they weren't able to transition to other forms of revenue, that could be a source of instability in oil-dependent countries that have run off this fossil fuel industry for decades. Yeah, that's a great question. And because of some of the differences you describe, there was much less information available to me about corruption in some of the Chinese oil industry affairs. So there is no equivalent to the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in China, at least not in how it's enforced here. And there is the press is different, the NGO civil society landscape is different. And it was those actors who provided the source material that I used for the book. And so I talk way more about American, British, Swiss, Dutch companies than Chinese companies. I do not think that is because those companies are more corruption prone. They're just subject to more oversight. And so my answer kind of has to be, I'm not sure, because we don't have the visibility into what the political manipulations and payoffs and things are. There are a few cases where we get tiny glimpses of what it looks like, but it's unclear. It's difficult to compare those sets of actors with such unlimited information. I mean, one case that does jump out to mind is that in South Sudan, Western companies have Western oil companies have basically said this is too risky for us, especially since the escalation of the civil war. But there are Chinese companies still working there, producing oil, and Malaysian and Indian companies as well, partnering with a national oil company. And a couple NGOs exposed how the national oil company was taking money from its accounts and using it to pay militias and fund militia activities. That complicity of those companies, I think, shows their higher risk tolerance, their longer horizons maybe, and there's a few other examples that would suggest maybe similar findings. But mostly it's a point of frustration that I don't think we can capture the full universe of what corruption looks like in terms of Chinese investments and their involvement with political elites in Africa and elsewhere versus the more Western companies. Yeah, I mean, I do think that there's progress when the producer country embraces transparency and accountability and civil society. And so, through the EITI and other measures, Chinese companies are having to disclose information about their activities because, Ghana or, Iraq or whatever country it is demanding it, not because the Chinese government is demanding it. So that's kind of one promising dynamic, that if there are domestic accountability functions that are working in the producing country, that can kind of level the playing field, because they could ask questions of the Chinese investors just as equally as they could the British or the American investors. But I know for groups like mine, it's a real uphill battle, and I think the temptation to focus on Western companies where the opportunities to influence them are so much easier is we go in that direction, because the Chinese companies, the national oil companies and others, you just don't know, there aren't many handholds to grab onto. Yep. I think that, so Trump has made a couple statements about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, saying that it puts US companies at a disadvantage and it should be gotten rid of. I think that there is a discourse that could be adopted to defend certain actions, like getting rid of the FCPA, along those lines, that we need to be able to compete in the global marketplace, so why are we holding ourselves to higher standards than foreign companies, or especially non-Western companies. One way that's playing out right now is the US, as part of the Wall Street Reform Act in 2010, passed a law that would require US and US listed companies to disclose oil and mining companies, how much they disclose to how much they pay to foreign governments. Sorry, so like Exxon would every year have to produce a report that said, this is how much we paid in taxes and royalties to Russia, to Venezuela, to Nigeria, and break it down in a really detailed manner by project. So in 2010, the US passed that law. The oil lobby immediately swept in, sued the US government, saying, you can't implement this goes way beyond your mandate, and won. And so then it started this back and forth. Over time, the rule was not being implemented because it was caught up in these legal battles. Trump comes to office, and one of the first things he does was to vacate this rule and say, no, the SEC, you have to abandon it or alter it radically. And the justifications given are all about competitiveness. Meanwhile, the European Union has passed the same law, and all the companies in Europe that were complaining about it are implementing it, and the sky has not fallen. They have not been kicked out of any of the countries where they're operating. They're making all their disclosure payments. And so it's kind of practice is undermining the competitiveness arguments that the US continues to make, but it doesn't matter. The inconsistency between practice and the arguments is not keeping the arguments from moving forward. And right now, the SEC is in a couple months, will probably finalize a very weak interpretation of this rule so that the payment data that the companies have to provide is almost pointless. Like, they've watered it down so much that the reporting will provide no actual useful transparency. So I think it's a useful story of how different interest groups combined with a political climate can create these really suboptimal outcomes in the name of competition and US interests, but it's really much more about the oil lobby and the Trump government's willingness to kind of do what it says. On a very upbeat note. I mean, in some ways it's a similar, my thought is similar as it was about transparency, that law enforcement is part of the mix of tools that we need to continue. Like, there is some success happening, but it needs to be much more consistent, not pursued only when it's politically convenient. So it at best is one tool in the toolkit. I don't want to sound naive, but I do believe that there is important progress that's been made. For a number of years, the US was the only country that actively enforced its anti-bribery laws. It's one of the few things that we've really done well in this space, is the active enforcement of the FCPA. In the last 10 years, actually thanks a lot to the OECD, the rest of the OECD in particular, so mostly like Canada definitely, a lot of European governments, definitely the UK, have improved their anti-bribery laws, made them much stricter, and upped enforcement. And so now you see anti-bribery cases being brought by all those governments as well, which means the community of companies that's covered and subject to active enforcement has grown sizably. And then some of them are taking novel and more aggressive approaches to defining what bribery is and what cases can be brought. It's super uneven. And there is opportunities for it to be politicized. I mean, there's some criticism that if you look at the FCPA cases, a lot of them are US listed foreign companies. And so is the FCPA going after enough US companies, or is it more likely to take cases against US listed foreign companies? So by no means is it perfect, but that doesn't mean that there's not progress being made. And again, to reiterate, like, I think awareness of cross-border illicit financial flows and how integral that is to the way corruption functions, and not just the kind of corruption I've talked about, but also human trafficking and drug trafficking, terrorism. Awareness of that has gone way up. I think there is action in trying to get these secrecy jurisdictions where all these anonymous shell companies proliferate to improve their standards. And so I would point to that progress, but by no means claim that it's going to do the trick or is, solving the problem already. If that's helpful. I honestly haven't thought about it or thought about that comparison, but I think it's a very timely and interesting question. And what it does spark in my head is the movement for greater transparency is in some ways coming up against some very real privacy concerns, which are driven in part by what you're talking about. So there's a push in a number of countries to disclose beneficial ownership information, which means who are the actual people who own a company, names, addresses, dates of birth. And the EU was like, great, let's establish these registers, let's make them public, and then they put the brakes on it because there were all these privacy concerns around, people's right to their own data and that kind of thing. And so that's a dynamic that I think is playing out a little bit in the transparency advocacy space right now, but I'm sure it has way more dimensions along the lines you're talking about that I really haven't thought about. Thank you all. Great, thanks.